What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Today, we'll be chatting with Ben Beecken from Locked On Wolves, the Minnesota Timberwolves finally unveiling their Twin Towers front court duo of Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns. What did the front court duo, the double center lineup, look like in the Wolves' final preseason game? We're going to talk about that in just a second after a quick message from our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your football betting info and odds this season. Find out your latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game that you can get your hands on. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every single sport out there. They've got you covered for football. They've got you covered for basketball, which is right around the corner. MLB postseason, all the fighting odds, UFC, MMA, boxing, you name it, they've got you covered over at BetOnline. Right now, you can take a look at who the odds-on favorites are to win the NBA title this season. The Golden State Warriors leading the pack at plus 575. You got the Boston Celtics right behind them at plus 650. The Milwaukee Bucks at plus 700. Then rounding out the top five, you have the Brooklyn Nets and the LA Clippers both at plus 750 apiece. So for all of that and more odds, head over to betonline.net to learn more about the trends in action available to you. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Joining us now is Ben Beecken, the host of Locked On Wolves. You can follow on Twitter at BBeacon. Now, Ben, one of the biggest stories of the offseason was the Minnesota Timberwolves acquiring former Utah Jazz star big man Rudy Gobert, and we had to wait until the very final Wolves preseason game to even get a glimpse at what he and Karl-Anthony Towns would look like in the front court for the Wolves together. We're going to talk about that here in just a moment, how those two kind of coexisted on the floor with one another, but I gotta ask you right from the jump, why did we have to wait until the final Wolves preseason game to get to see those two guys actually share the court together?
Yeah, it was a combination of factors. Karl-Anthony Towns had a non-COVID illness that actually he was hospitalized for a few days right at the start of training camp. So he actually missed media day, missed the full first week of training camp, and then came back to practice right when preseason games started. And so he was sick, started practicing, and then Rudy sat out a couple of games because he played in Eurobasket and really didn't get much of an offseason. And so there was like 2 games where Rudy played, a game where neither played, then one game that Towns played that Rudy sat out, and then the last preseason game they both played. So it was a combination of factors, but it was good to finally see them on the floor together.
And so I don't know if we should take too much from this game, because they wound up the one preseason game that they lost was the one game where they both played. So right. I'm sure there's going to be some doubters who are like, I told you so. It's not going to work. You give us your 2 cents on what it looked like with those two guys actually sharing the floor, some of the highs, some of the lows from their one game sample size playing together.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly clunky at times. I mean, the lane was clogged because you've got two guys who are very, their role was, I mean, obviously Towns is a much more diverse and effective offensive game than Rudy Gobert, but Gobert is arguably the best roller in the league. He did a lot of pick and roll in Utah with Donovan Mitchell and others, and Karl-Anthony Towns did a lot of pick and roll in Minnesota with D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards, and they're both used to roll into the basket. They're both used to kind of hanging out down near the paint, depending on the set that they're running. And so there wasn't a whole lot of space. And clearly there's going to be a pretty big learning curve. And so like Anthony Edwards had a pretty bad game on Friday. And I think part of that was because he was trying to figure out like, hey, there's a lot of guys in the paint right now. Typically the Wolves could space out, Towns would be outside the arc. But in this case, obviously Rudy's not going to stray too far from the paint. So it was certainly clunky, but there were also some possessions that were a ton of fun. I mean, there was Cat driving from the left slot, getting into the paint and throwing a no-look, wraparound pass to Rudy for an and one dunk. There were a couple plays like that were just absolutely tantalizing. Like, hey, they could do this thing and space out, have Rudy in the dunker spot. Anybody can drive to the basket. You could do a big pick and roll with Cat and Rudy. There were a couple of other possessions where there were just kind of like secondary actions where they ran a couple of different horn sets where both guys were on the elbows and they did some cross screen action, and Towns is deadly from anywhere. And Rudy is the best in the league in terms of roll gravity and sucking the defense into the paint and creating space for Towns. So while it was certainly clunky, they lost the game. Neither guy played a full, they weren't great with both players on the floor, but each of them was around 30 minutes, a little bit less. So they didn't play full games either. You could definitely see a lot of the fun, Chris Finch is going to have a ton of fun, messing with his different offensive sets throughout the season.
And then how did they look on the other side of the court? Because obviously we kind of know what Rudy Gobert brings to the table defensively. He's basically like a walking top 10 defense in and by himself. But how did he kind of match up when he and Towns were on the floor sharing that side of the court together?
Yeah, for the most part, they played drop pick and roll coverage, which is what Utah did pretty exclusively with Gobert. And the Wolves can do that with Gobert. They can't really do that with Towns. Towns isn't great there. For the most part, they did that in pick and roll, and Rudy was guarding fives, although they can flip it. And they did that a couple of times in the game where Towns was guarding the five. And then you can let Rudy kind of roam, like whoever the worst offensive players on the other team, that's Rudy's man. And then he can also just kind of roam into the paint and block shots, which is how Utah defended the Wolves in the past. Was Rudy didn't guard Towns. He just kind of lurked, and he guarded Jared Vanderbilt last year. So that's another option for the Wolves. I actually thought they played pretty well defensively against Brooklyn on Friday. Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving both just went off, especially in the first half, and they had a great offensive game. The Wolves were pretty good. They were a little over aggressive at times. It's almost like they forgot that Rudy was there to bail them out at the rim. Because last year the Wolves played this like pretty exclusively. They played like an aggressive blitzing defense on the perimeter where you had Ant jumping passing lanes, and last year was Pat Bev and Jared Vanderbilt trying to just get steals and get out and run. And they don't need to do that this year. Like sometimes I think you can mix it in, maybe when Rudy's off the floor, but when Gobert's on the floor, just play solid defense and let Rudy clean up your mess. I mean, already the perimeter defense should be better than it was in Utah. So you're not going to leave Gobert in an island too often. So it looked good. Like I thought, and it was a decent defense last year, but like you said, Rudy should automatically make this team a top 10 defense. They just need to kind of clean up some of the missed assignments and remember, like, hey, he's on the back line and he's going to bail you guys out if you let somebody get into the paint.
What to you, Ben, is going to be kind of just the biggest adjustment for those two, just to start learning how to kind of thrive with one another on the floor, sharing those minutes together?
I think it's offense. I think it's spacing. We saw what teams defensively, we saw what teams did last year to Utah in terms of playing five out and making Rudy kind of, play two guys on the same possession. I don't think that's going to be a huge issue. Towns is good enough defensively. They've got enough perimeter defenders. They'll figure it out on defense. A good defensive team adding arguably the best defender in the league, they'll figure it out. Offensively, it's going to be some of the spacing stuff. It's going to be, Towns prefers to pop and Gobert obviously prefers to roll. But Towns also rolled sometimes last year. And what if Rudy's not involved in the action and he's just kind of lurking in the dunker spot? That's a pretty it's a player who wants the ball in his hands in Rudy Gobert as well. He's not Jared Vanderbilt. Like he's going to expect the ball. So I think kind of figuring that out for Ant and D'Lo to figure out where they fit in, it's going to take some time. I said this on the show after the Brooklyn game Friday. The Wolves play like they did against the Nets on Friday. They play like Oklahoma City twice and they have a pretty easy schedule to start. I think they win most of those games. So it's kind of nice in that they get a little bit of runway to figure it out. And then the hope is though that you figure it out before you start playing, the really good, the Phoenixes who they play in a couple weeks, or it could get pretty ugly because the offense was definitely clunky and it's going to take a minute to make sure it rounds into form.
Yeah, I've got the T-Wolves kind of painted as my Western Conference team to take a significant jump this year. I kind of have them painted as like a 50-win plus team just because of how much Rudy Gobert adds defensively, and then they were already a really potent offensive team as well. You mentioned his name a couple times there a few moments ago, Ben, but Jaden McDaniels reportedly going to be the starting three for this Wolves team. How important is he to what Chris Finch and the organization really want to try and achieve defensively in conjunction with obviously the addition of Rudy Gobert?
Yeah, I think this term gets overused, but I think he is the X factor for this team. You kind of already know what, we know what Rudy and Cat are. Obviously things are going to shift. We know what Ant should take a leap, and that's, I think we're kind of penciling that in, and maybe we should be careful there. But Ant's obviously, we mostly know what he is or what he's going to be. Same with D'Lo. Jaden McDaniels is the guy who, reportedly they refused to include in the Rudy Gobert trade. They said, no, take more picks. We want to keep Jaden McDaniels. And he hasn't, he's shown flashes of being like a true, like an all defense, all NBA defensive team type player, but it hasn't been consistent enough. The offense, it's a below average 3-point jump shot that McDaniels has. There's some work he's got to do there. Where does he fit in with this team moving forward? But I do think he has the upside of being their best perimeter defender. Right now, I would say Ant is actually a better perimeter defender than Jaden McDaniels, but McDaniels has all the tools, right? He's long, he's athletic, he's quick, laterally. He has the size to guard fours in terms of his length, but the quickness to guard some twos and threes. So if he can like really lock in, the biggest issue for him is foul trouble, and he picked up 3 quick ones on Friday against Brooklyn. If he can stay out of foul trouble and just kind of refine some of the tools he's got, the raw tools he's got on defense, then he's going to be a huge part of this defense. You're looking at Rudy Ant and Jaden McDaniels as your plus defenders, assuming Ant takes another incremental step forward, it's going to be a really good defense. And McDaniels, there's offensive upside too. We just don't know yet what exactly that's going to look like because he's clearly the fifth option in the starting lineup.
You talked about, Ben, saving the best for last year, I guess, with Anthony Edwards, but you said maybe that we shouldn't be penciling in a year 3 leap for Ant. I mean, I kind of think just you look at his career progression to this point, I think it makes a lot of sense that he's going to take another jump this year. Yeah. The preseason numbers don't exactly jump off the page, but it's preseason, so kind of who cares. But I mean, what are you hoping to see? What are your kind of expectations for Ant coming into this season to have yet another jump in his career trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The trajectory that I like comparing this to is Ja Morant, and obviously that would be massive. Morant went from like a fringe all-star, not quite an all-star player, his second year to probably a top 10 player in the league this year or coming out of last year. That's the type of jump. And if you actually look at the first 2 seasons of Ja Morant's career and the first 2 of Ant's, they're really similar in terms of efficiency, getting to the line. Now, Ant's already a better defender than Ja Morant is today, and I think that gives him a big edge. He's a significantly better defender. He's got more size, and he's also a better perimeter shooter. But Ja's obviously incredible going to the basket, and Ant's got to improve around the basket. That's the type of leap that I think, if that happens, I mean, this is easily a 50-plus win team, if not, a top 3 seed in the West. That's where I just want to be a little cautious. Like, that's what we should be hoping for. And I think it's realistic. We saw a couple different playoff games. There were some other flashes last year where it's like, if Ant plays like this, it's over. I mean, he's a top 10 player immediately. But like you said, preseason's been a little bit rough, and you don't want to put too much stock into it. But he still has those games where he's a little disinterested, and the pull up threes are way too attractive for him versus getting into the paint and trying to get to the line. Shying away from contact sometimes. So it's finding that balance, and the consistency is really. And of course, I'm nitpicking because he's phenomenal, but that's what needs to happen. He needs to bring it every single night. He needs to be more comfortable going to the basket versus shooting pull up jumpers. Because the jumper's there if he needs it, but he's going to be so much more efficient and open up the rest of his game if he goes to the paint more often. So I really think that the sky is the limit, obviously, for Ant. But if he can make a Ja Morant-like leap, I mean, look out for where this Wolves team could go this year.
How will the Twin Towers experiment look as the Wolves start the season between Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns? Will Anthony Edwards be in store for a year 3 leap similar to Ja Morant? Of course, you're going to have us covered for all of that and more over at Locked On Wolves. Ben, I appreciate you stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Of course. Thanks, Jackson.